The courtroom was silent, the air thick with tension as the final moments of the trial unfolded. All eyes were on Judge Malcolm Brewer, a figure of authority whose rulings were known to carry the weight of an iron gavel. For decades, he had stood as a symbol of justice in Fresno, California, firm, unwavering, and bound by the law. But on this day, the decision he was about to deliver would ripple far beyond the courtroom walls, altering lives in ways no one could foresee. At the defense table stood Ryan Hale, a 24-year-old black man whose life was about to change forever. His hands trembled slightly as he gripped the edge of the table, but his gaze remained steady. Ryan wasn't the hardened criminal the prosecution had painted him to be. He was just a young man trying to survive in a world that often felt stacked against him. A part-time mechanic with dreams of becoming something greater, Ryan had always believed that if you stayed honest and worked hard, the truth would prevail. But today, his faith in that belief hung by a thread. Judge Brewer cleared his throat, his deep voice breaking the heavy silence. "Mr. Hale, you stand convicted by a jury of your peers for crimes that have caused immeasurable harm to this community." He paused, his piercing eyes scanning the packed courtroom. "Your actions were reckless, calculated, and devoid of any remorse." In the back row, Ryan's mother stifled a sob, her trembling hands clutching a worn photograph of her son as a child. To her, Ryan was still the same boy who used to dream of becoming a firefighter, the boy who would stay up late reading books about bravery and justice. She had pleaded with the court to see him as more than just a case file, to consider the life she had raised with so much love and hope. But her cries had been drowned out by the mountain of evidence that now loomed over her son. The evidence had seemed damning: eyewitness accounts, surveillance footage, fingerprints on the weapon, and an anonymous tip that pointed directly to Ryan. It painted a picture of him as the masked gunman who had stormed into Carter's jewelers, stealing over $150,000 worth of goods and leaving a store clerk fighting for his life. But Ryan had maintained his innocence from the very beginning, swearing he wasn't anywhere near the scene that fateful day. His alibi, a double shift at the auto shop, had fallen apart when his boss couldn't verify his whereabouts. In the eyes of the jury, the verdict was clear. Judge Brewer's voice grew firmer as he continued. "I hereby sentence you to 60 years in state prison, with no possibility of parole for the first 30 years. The gavel struck the oak block with a resounding thud, echoing through the room like a final, irreversible judgment. Gasps rippled through the courtroom. Reporters scrambled to jot down notes, their pens scratching furiously against their notepads. Ryan stood frozen, his face a mask of quiet defiance, though the slight clench of his jaw betrayed the storm raging inside him. He turned to look at his mother one last time, as the bailiff led him away in handcuffs. Her tear-streaked face broke his heart, but he didn't let a single tear fall. He wouldn't give them that satisfaction. Back in his chambers, Judge Brewer poured himself a cup of black coffee, the rich aroma doing little to soothe his unease. He stared into the swirling liquid, the weight of the day pressing heavily on his shoulders. Brewer wasn't a man prone to second-guessing his decisions. Decades on the bench had taught him to trust the law and the evidence it presented. But as he signed the sentencing papers, a faint flicker of doubt gnawed at the edges of his mind. He shook it off, attributing it to the fatigue that came with such high-profile cases. The Hale robbery case had been a spectacle from the start, dominating headlines and captivating the public's attention. To many, it seemed like an open-and-shut case. A young black man with no alibi, fingerprints on the weapon, and a history of financial struggles. But to those who knew Ryan, the conviction felt like a cruel twist of fate. They couldn't reconcile the image of the caring, hard-working mechanic with that of a cold-blooded criminal. Unbeknownst to Judge Brewer, the truth about the case was far from settled. That night, as he filed away the paperwork and prepared to move on to the next trial, a piece of forgotten evidence began to resurface. A fragment of truth buried deep within the layers of lies and corruption. It started with an innocuous discovery, a detail so small it almost escaped notice. But as it unraveled, it revealed a web of deceit that ran deeper than anyone could have imagined. The first crack in the seemingly airtight case came from an unlikely source. An evidence log from an unrelated investigation. Brewer stumbled across it while reviewing paperwork for a new trial involving police misconduct. At first, it seemed irrelevant, just another document in the endless sea of legal briefs. But then, a name caught his eye. Ryan Hale. His pulse quickened as he read further. The log listed a gun matching the description of the weapon used in the Carter's jewelers' robbery. But there was one glaring problem. The gun had been seized in a separate case 2 days after the robbery, making it impossible for it to have been the weapon used in the crime. Brewer sat back in his chair, a cold realization settling over him. If the gun hadn't been used in the robbery, then the fingerprints on it couldn't have been Ryan's. His mind raced with the implications. Had the wrong man been convicted? Had he, in his pursuit of justice, sentenced an innocent young man to a lifetime behind bars? Determined to uncover the truth, Brewer began to dig deeper. He requested additional files, cross-referenced case records, and reviewed every piece of evidence with a fine-tooth comb. What he found shook him to his core. The anonymous tip that had led to Ryan's arrest wasn't as random as it seemed. The call had originated from a burner phone registered under the name of Detective Lewis, the lead investigator on the case. It was a detail that had gone unnoticed during the trial, but now screamed of foul play. Brewer's unease turned to anger as the pieces began to fit together. The fingerprints, the coerced witness testimonies, the missing alibi, all of it pointed to a carefully constructed narrative designed to ensure a conviction. But why? And how deep did the corruption go? As Brewer delved further into the case, he knew he was treading dangerous waters. Uncovering the truth could unravel not just the Hale robbery case, but the very foundation of trust in the justice system he had spent his life upholding. But for Ryan, sitting in a prison cell for a crime he didn't commit, the stakes were far greater. Brewer couldn't ignore the gnawing sense of responsibility. He had the power to set things right, or at least to try. And so, the journey for the truth began, a journey that would lead Brewer down a path of moral reckoning, uncovering secrets that many had worked hard to bury. But as he took the first steps, he couldn't shake the feeling that this was just the beginning of something much larger and far more dangerous. The fight for justice was about to take a turn no one could have predicted. As the days turned into nights, Ryan sat in his dimly lit prison cell, staring at the grey concrete walls that now defined his world. The cacophony of distant voices and the metallic clang of cell doors slamming shut became his constant soundtrack. Yet, through it all, Ryan's mind refused to accept the reality thrust upon him. He replayed every moment of his trial, every question asked, and every piece of evidence presented, searching for something he might have missed. Anything that could prove his innocence. The weight of the injustice bore down on him, but so did an unshakable determination to find a way out. Ryan wasn't alone in his struggle. In the outside world, his younger sister Maya had made it her mission to clear his name. At just 19, Maya was fiercely intelligent and unrelenting, with a knack for uncovering details others overlooked. She refused to let her brother's life be stolen by a broken system. From the moment the sentence was handed down, Maya had dived headfirst into the case, sifting through court transcripts and scouring every shred of evidence the defense had managed to gather. One night, as she sat in the cramped living room of their small apartment, Maya stumbled upon something peculiar, a discrepancy in the timeline presented during the trial. The prosecution had argued that Ryan fled the scene of the robbery in a silver sedan, a vehicle later found abandoned with traces of his DNA on the steering wheel. But Maya remembered something Ryan had said to her before the trial began. "I haven't touched a car like that in years," he had insisted. At the time, she chalked it up to nerves, but now it annoyed her. Why would his DNA be on a car he claimed he'd never driven? Determined to get answers, Maya tracked down the vehicle's impound records. Her hands shook as she flipped through the pages until she found the report. The car had been towed 2 days before the robbery for unpaid parking tickets. How then could it have been used as a getaway vehicle? Maya felt a surge of adrenaline. This was more than a mistake. It was a lie. But who had planted the evidence and why? Back at the courthouse, Judge Brewer was grappling with his own doubts. He couldn't shake the feeling that something sinister was at play. As he pored over the evidence log and cross-referenced the files, Brewer began to notice a pattern. The same detective, Lewis, had been involved in several other cases with questionable outcomes. Each time, the evidence seemed airtight, almost too perfect. Brewer's instincts, honed over decades on the bench, told him that Lewis was more than just a zealous investigator. Brewer decided to dig deeper into Lewis's history, quietly requesting internal records and disciplinary files. What he found painted a troubling picture. Complaints of misconduct had been filed against Lewis over the years, most of them dismissed without investigation. Witnesses in past cases have recanted their statements, claiming they'd been pressured or threatened. Brewer felt his stomach churn as he read through the files. If Lewis was willing to manipulate evidence and intimidate witnesses, how many innocent people had been wrongfully convicted under his watch? But uncovering the truth was easier said than done. Brewer knew he couldn't confront Lewis directly without tipping his hand. Instead, he enlisted the help of an old friend, Marcus Ellison, a retired journalist with a reputation for uncovering corruption. Marcus had spent his career exposing scandals that others were too afraid to touch, and Brewer trusted him implicitly. Over coffee in a quiet diner on the outskirts of town, Brewer laid out everything he discovered. "This goes deeper than Ryan Hale's case," Brewer said, his voice low. "If I'm right, we're looking at systemic corruption. Lewis isn't working alone." Marcus leaned back in his chair, his sharp eyes scanning the judge's face. "You know this could blow up in your face, right? If you go after Lewis and the department, they won't just roll over. They'll fight back." "I know," Brewer admitted, "but I can't sit by and do nothing. An innocent man's life is at stake." Meanwhile, inside the prison walls, Ryan began to build alliances with other inmates, many of whom had their own stories of wrongful convictions and police misconduct. One man, Darnell, had spent over a decade in prison for crime he swore he didn't commit. He had a sharp mind and an encyclopedic knowledge of the legal system, having spent years studying law books in the prison library. Darnell took Ryan under his wing, teaching him how to navigate the appeals process and encouraging him to keep fighting. "You can't let them break you," Darnell said one afternoon as they sat in the yard. "That's what they want. They think if they lock us up, we'll disappear, but we've got to stay strong. They can't silence the truth forever." Ryan nodded, drawing strength from Darnell's words. He began spending hours in the library, combing through case law and drafting letters to advocacy organizations. Each day brought a small flicker of hope, even as the weight of his sentence loomed over him. Back in the city, Maya's investigation took a dangerous turn. She had started to receive anonymous threats, warning her to stop digging into the case. At first, she dismissed them as scare tactics. But when she found her car tires slashed and her apartment broken into, she realized someone was serious about silencing her. Still, Maya refused to back down. She knew she was onto something, and the closer she got to the truth, the more desperate her brother's enemies became. One night, while reviewing surveillance footage from the day of the robbery, Maya noticed something she hadn't seen before. In the corner of the screen, partially obscured by a parked truck, was a figure wearing a hoodie. The person's face wasn't visible, but their movements caught her attention. They appeared to be holding something, a bag perhaps, and they disappeared into a side alley moments before the robbery occurred. Maya zoomed in on the footage, her heart racing. Could this be a real culprit? Maya reached out to Brewer, sharing her findings and pleading for his help. Together, they began to piece together the fragments of a larger conspiracy, one that pointed to corruption not just within the police department, but also within the prosecution's office. As the evidence mounted, Brewer realized he was walking a dangerous line. Exposing the truth could cost him his career, or worse, his life. But the thought of Ryan spending decades behind bars for a crime he didn't commit was a burden he couldn't bear. As Maya and Brewer pushed forward, forces beyond their control began to close in. Detective Lewis, sensing that his secrets were unraveling, started taking drastic measures to cover his tracks. Witnesses disappeared, records were mysteriously erased, and those who dared to speak out found themselves facing threats and intimidation. The deeper they dug, the clearer it became that Ryan's case was just the tip of the iceberg. What had started as a quest to prove one man's innocence was rapidly turning into a battle against a system designed to protect itself at all costs. For Maya, Brewer, and Ryan, the road ahead was fraught with danger, but none of them were willing to back down. They were fighting not just for justice, but for the truth, a truth that had the power to change everything. But as the shadows around them deepened, they couldn't shake the feeling that time was running out. Detective Lewis sat in his car, parked in the shadows of a quiet street, gripping the steering wheel tightly. His mind raced as he thought about the cracks forming in the carefully constructed cases he had built over the years. The name Ryan Hale had become a thorn in his side, and now Maya's persistence was threatening to unravel everything. Lewis wasn't a man who made mistakes, but the threads of his lies were beginning to show, and that was dangerous. He couldn't afford to let anyone pull too hard on them. Not Maya, not Judge Brewer, and certainly not Ryan. Meanwhile, Maya found herself at a crossroads. Every step forward brought new revelations, but also greater risks. After discovering the figure in the surveillance footage, she worked tirelessly to identify them. She visited local businesses asking if anyone recognized the alley or the person in the video. Her questions were met with hesitation, and some people refused to speak to her at all, their eyes darting nervously as if they knew something but were too afraid to say it. Late one evening, Maya got a call from an unknown number. A deep voice on the other end whispered, "Stop asking questions, or you'll regret it." Then the line went dead. Her hands trembled as she stared at her phone. The threats were becoming more personal, but she refused to let fear control her. She thought of Ryan, alone in his cell, and it fueled her resolve. If someone was willing to go to these lengths to scare her, it meant she was on the right track. At the same time, Judge Brewer continued his quiet investigation into Detective Lewis. Through his old friend Marcus, Brewer learned about another man, Jamal Dixon, who had been convicted in a case eerily similar to Ryan's. Jamal had been accused of armed robbery based on DNA evidence and a witness statement. But Brewer discovered that the witness had later recanted, claiming Lewis had pressured them into identifying Jamal. The parallels were too striking to ignore, and Brewer knew this wasn't a coincidence. Jamal's case was just one of many. Brewer decided to meet with Jamal's family, hoping to gather more information. Jamal's mother, a soft-spoken woman named Grace, welcomed him into her modest home with weary eyes. She had spent years fighting for her son's freedom, but the system had worn her down. As they talked, Brewer felt a pang of guilt. He had spent years presiding over cases like Jamal's, trusting the evidence and the officers who presented it. Now he couldn't help but wonder how many innocent lives had been destroyed under his watch. Grace shared stories of Jamal's arrest and trial, painting a picture of a young man who had been targeted because of his circumstances. He had grown up in a rough neighborhood, and his past mistakes made him an easy scapegoat. But Grace was adamant that her son wasn't a criminal. They didn't care about the truth, she said softly. They just needed someone to blame. Brewer left Grace's house with a heavy heart, more determined than ever to expose the corruption that had ensnared both Jamal and Ryan. But he knew the road ahead would be treacherous. Lewis wasn't just any detective. He had powerful allies within the police department and the prosecutor's office. If Brewer pushed too hard, he could find himself on the wrong side of the system he had devoted his life to upholding. Inside the prison, Ryan's resolve was tested daily. The weight of his sentence was crushing, and the uncertainty of whether he would ever prove his innocence loomed over him like a dark cloud. Darnell continued to mentor him, teaching him how to channel his frustration into action. Together, they started working on a detailed appeal, highlighting the inconsistencies in the evidence against Ryan. Darnell encouraged Ryan to write letters to journalists, legal organizations, and anyone who might be willing to listen. One day, while sitting in the prison library, Ryan overheard a conversation between two inmates. They were talking about Detective Lewis and how his name had come up in several wrongful conviction cases. One of the men, an older inmate named Carlos, claimed to have been framed by Lewis years ago. "He's dirty," Carlos said, his voice low. "He plants evidence and bullies people into saying what he wants. It's not about justice for him. It's about winning." Ryan's ears perked up. He approached Carlos after the conversation, cautiously asking for more details. Carlos was reluctant at first, but Ryan's sincerity won him over. Carlos shared his story, explaining how Lewis had fabricated evidence to secure his conviction. "They don't care about the truth, kid," Carlos said bitterly. "They just care about closing cases." Ryan felt a surge of anger and determination. Lewis wasn't just responsible for his imprisonment. He was part of a larger pattern of corruption that had destroyed countless lives. Ryan knew he couldn't fight this battle alone, but he also knew he couldn't give up. Every story he heard, every piece of information he uncovered, brought him closer to the truth. As Brewer, Maya, and Ryan continued their separate yet interconnected quests for justice, the walls around them seemed to close in. Brewer faced increasing pressure from his colleagues to drop his inquiries into Lewis. Maya found herself under constant surveillance, her every move watched by unseen eyes. And Ryan, though growing stronger in his resolve, knew that time was not on his side. The closer they got to the truth, the more dangerous their journey became. It was clear that exposing Lewis and the system that protected him would come at a great cost. But for Ryan, for Jamal, and for every innocent person who had been wrongfully convicted, the fight was worth it. They weren't just seeking justice, they were demanding accountability, and they wouldn't stop until the truth was brought to light. As Maya sat in her dimly lit apartment, her eyes scanned the screen of her laptop for the 100th time that evening. The pieces of the puzzle were starting to form a picture, but it wasn't yet complete. Every document she unearthed, every witness she spoke to, seemed to point to a vast network of misconduct. Detective Lewis wasn't acting alone. His methods were protected and possibly encouraged by others in positions of power. It wasn't just about Ryan or Jamal anymore. It was about an entire system that thrived on its ability to silence the vulnerable and protect its own. The air in the room felt heavy as her phone buzzed. It was another message from an unknown number, this time with a single warning. Asterisk, asterisk, stop now, or you'll regret it. Asterisk, asterisk, Maya's pulse quickened. She was used to the vague threats by now, but this one felt different. It wasn't just an attempt to scare her. It was a direct promise of harm. She glanced out of her window, half expecting to see someone watching from the shadows. But the street below was empty, save for a single streetlight flickering faintly. Despite the fear clawing at her, Maya knew she couldn't stop. She thought about Ryan, alone in his prison cell, counting on her to keep fighting. Her fingers hovered over the keyboard as she began drafting an email to a contact in the press. If she could get the story out to the public, it might force the system to act. But she hesitated. What if the backlash put her in even greater danger? She closed the laptop and leaned back, staring at the ceiling. Her mind was made up. She would push forward, no matter the cost. Meanwhile, Judge Brewer's investigation was also reaching a boiling point. He had uncovered enough evidence to confirm his suspicions about Lewis, but presenting it would be risky. Brewer knew he would be stepping on powerful toes, and there was no guarantee the system would respond the way he hoped. His office had already received several anonymous calls hinting that his career and his reputation were on the line if he continued. But Brewer's conscience wouldn't let him look the other way any longer. He wasn't just doing this for Ryan. He was doing it for himself, to make amends for the years he had trusted a broken system. Brewer decided to meet with Maya in person, hoping to combine their efforts. They arranged to meet at a small cafe on the edge of town, away from prying eyes. As Brewer walked in, he spotted Maya at a corner table, her face a mixture of exhaustion and determination. They exchanged cautious greetings before diving into their findings. Maya shared the surveillance footage she had obtained, along with testimonies from witnesses who had been pressured by Lewis. Brewer, in turn, revealed a pattern of misconduct he had uncovered in previous cases. That conversation was interrupted when Brewer noticed a man at a nearby table, pretending to read a newspaper but glancing their way far too often. Brewer leaned in and whispered, "We're being watched." Maya's heart raced as she glanced discreetly at the man. They decided to cut the meeting short, agreeing to communicate only through encrypted channels moving forward. As they left the cafe, Maya couldn't shake the feeling that they were being followed. Inside the prison, Ryan's frustration grew as he waited for any news from Maya or his lawyer. Every day felt like a battle to keep his hope alive. The other inmates had begun to notice his determination and started sharing their own stories of injustice. One man in particular caught Ryan's attention. Malik, a former journalist, had been imprisoned for a crime he swore he didn't commit. Malik claimed to have been investigating police corruption before his arrest, and his knowledge of the system's inner workings was invaluable. The two men formed an unlikely alliance, with Malik offering Ryan guidance on how to navigate the complexities of the legal system. Malik also warned Ryan about the risks of digging too deep. "When you start poking holes in their stories, they'll come for you," he said grimly. But Ryan was beyond fear. He had already lost everything: his freedom, his reputation, and the life he had dreamed of. The only thing left was the truth, and he was determined to find it. As days turned into weeks, the tension outside the prison walls escalated. Maya's investigation had drawn the attention of a local news outlet, which agreed to run a story on Ryan's case. The article detailed the questionable evidence used to convict him, the inconsistencies in witness statements, and Detective Lewis's history of misconduct. The story went viral, sparking outrage and calls for a deeper investigation. For the first time, Ryan felt a glimmer of hope. People were finally starting to listen. But the publicity came with a cost. Maya's apartment was broken into one night while she was out, her files and laptop ransacked. Although nothing of obvious value was taken, the message was clear. She was getting too close to the truth. She filed a report with the police, but her trust in them was non-existent. Instead, she doubled down on her efforts, backing up her findings and sharing them with multiple trusted sources. Detective Lewis, meanwhile, was feeling the heat. The media attention had put him under scrutiny, and whispers of an internal investigation were starting to circulate. He had always been careful to cover his tracks, but he knew that no plan was foolproof. As he sat in his office late one night, reviewing old case files, he received a call from an unknown number. "You need to handle this," the voice on the other end said coldly. Lewis's jaw tightened. He wasn't used to taking orders, but he knew he had no choice. His career and his freedom were on the line. The stage was set for a confrontation that would either expose the truth or bury it even deeper. The players in this dangerous game were all moving toward a collision, each one carrying their own secrets and motivations. For Maya, Brewer, and Ryan, the stakes couldn't be higher. They were up against a system that had been designed to protect itself at all costs, and the closer they got to justice, the more perilous their journey became. The clock was ticking, and with every passing moment, the tension reached unbearable heights. As the days pressed on, the tension in everyone's lives became almost unbearable. The media buzz surrounding Ryan's case grew louder, with more people beginning to question the legitimacy of his conviction. Maya's persistence had turned Ryan's story into a rallying cry for those who had been failed by the justice system. But with every step forward, new obstacles emerged, threatening to unravel everything they had worked for. One evening, as Maya combed through the latest batch of emails from whistleblowers and sympathizers, a message stood out. The sender was anonymous, the subject line stark. Asterisk, asterisk, evidence, you're missing. Asterisk, asterisk, the email contained an attachment, a video file, and a cryptic note. Asterisk, asterisk, this was never supposed to see the light of day. Be careful who you trust. Asterisk, asterisk, Maya's hands trembled as she clicked on the file. The grainy footage showed a conversation between Detective Lewis and another officer discussing Ryan's case. It was clear they were fabricating evidence to ensure his conviction. The conversation ended with Lewis saying, "This one needs to stick. No loose ends." The discovery sent a jolt of adrenaline through Maya. This was the break they needed, undeniable proof that Ryan's conviction was based on lies. But the email's warning echoed in her mind. Why had this footage been sent to her, and by whom? Was it a genuine act of conscience, or was someone trying to set her up? The possibilities swirled in her mind, but there was no time to waste. She shared the video with Judge Brewer, who was equally stunned by its implications. Brewer immediately began the process of verifying the video's authenticity, but the task was fraught with challenges. If they presented it too soon, without proper validation, it could backfire and discredit their entire case. And yet, the urgency of the situation weighed heavily on him. The public outcry was growing, but so was the resistance from powerful figures intent on keeping the truth buried. Brewer's own colleagues began to distance themselves from him, their once friendly conversations now tinged with suspicion and doubt. He realized he was becoming a liability in the eyes of the very institution he had dedicated his life to serving. Meanwhile, inside the prison, Ryan sensed a shift in the atmosphere. Guards who had once ignored him now seemed to be keeping a closer watch, their eyes lingering just a little too long. Other inmates whispered about the attention his case was drawing, some offering support, others warning him to tread carefully. Malik, ever the realist, pulled Ryan aside one afternoon. "They're nervous," he said quietly. "When people like Lewis feel cornered, they lash out. You need to be ready for anything." Ryan nodded, but he couldn't help feeling a flicker of hope. If Lewis and his allies were feeling the pressure, it meant that Maya and Brewer were making progress. For the first time in months, he allowed himself to imagine what freedom might feel like. But that hope was quickly tempered by the reality of his situation. Until the truth was fully exposed, he remained a pawn in a dangerous game. The tension reached a boiling point when Maya's phone rang late one night. The voice on the other end was shaky but urgent. "I don't have much time," the caller said. "I used to work with Lewis. I know things that can help you. But if they find out I'm talking to you..." The line went silent for a moment before the voice continued. "Meet me tomorrow at the old warehouse on 12th Street. Come alone." Maya's instincts screamed at her to be cautious, but she knew she couldn't ignore the chance to uncover more evidence. She informed Brewer of the call, and despite his protests, she insisted on going. "If this person has information, we need it," she argued. Brewer reluctantly agreed, but arranged for discreet surveillance nearby in case anything went wrong. The next evening, Maya arrived at the warehouse, her heart pounding. The space was dimly lit, the air thick with dust and the faint smell of oil. She called out, and a figure emerged from the shadows. A woman, mid-40s, her face lined with worry. "I was a clerk in the department," the woman began. "I processed files for Lewis and his team. I saw things I wasn't supposed to, fabricated reports, altered testimonies. I stayed quiet because I was scared. But when I saw your story in the news, I knew I had to come forward." As the woman spoke, Maya recorded every word, her mind racing with the implications. But just as the woman was about to hand over a folder of documents, a loud crash echoed through the warehouse. Both women froze as heavy footsteps approached. "Go," the woman hissed, shoving the folder into Maya's hands. "Take it and go." Maya didn't need to be told twice. She ran, clutching the folder to her chest, her breath coming in ragged gasps. Behind her, she heard the woman cry out, followed by the sound of a struggle. But Maya didn't dare look back. She made it to her car and sped away, her mind reeling. The documents in her lap felt like both a blessing and a curse. Whatever was in them had just put a target on her back, and the woman who had risked everything to help her was now in danger. Back at her apartment, Maya locked the door and immediately began sifting through the papers. They contained detailed records of Lewis's cases, including notes on how evidence was manipulated to secure convictions. It was a damning trail that implicated not just Lewis but others in the department as well. But as Maya read, one detail stood out: a mention of a high-ranking official who had signed off on many of the questionable actions. The corruption went higher than anyone had realized. The revelation sent a chill down her spine. This wasn't just about Ryan anymore. It was about an entire network of power and control, willing to destroy anyone who threatened its existence. Maya knew they were running out of time. With every new piece of evidence, the stakes grew higher, the risks greater. And somewhere out there, Lewis and his allies were watching, waiting for their moment to strike. The storm that had been brewing finally broke as Maya, Judge Brewer, and their team prepared to present the damning evidence. The video, the documents, and the whistleblower's testimony had been meticulously verified and assembled into an airtight case. With every piece of the puzzle in place, they were ready to file an emergency appeal for Ryan's conviction to be overturned. But even as they prepared to face the courts, a shadow of unease lingered over them. The forces they were up against had proven ruthless, and there was no guarantee of a clean fight. The courtroom was packed to capacity as the appeal hearing began. Journalists, activists, and curious onlookers filled every seat, their eyes fixed on the proceedings. Ryan sat silently, his hands clasped together, his expression calm, but his eyes filled with hope. Maya, seated behind him, felt the weight of the moment pressing down on her chest. Everything they had worked for, every sleepless night, and every risk they had taken, had led to this. Judge Brewer, now serving as Ryan's advocate, stood to address the court. His voice was steady, every word carefully measured as he laid out the evidence of corruption. The courtroom was silent as the video of Detective Lewis was played, his words condemning him more effectively than anything Brewer could say. Then came the documents, each one highlighting a pattern of misconduct that painted a clear picture of systemic corruption. Finally, the whistleblower herself was called to testify. Despite her fear, she spoke with conviction, her words cutting through the tension like a blade. As the evidence mounted, the defense representing the state grew visibly uneasy. They attempted to discredit the whistleblower, questioned the chain of custody for the video, and argued that the documents were taken out of context. But their arguments faltered under the weight of the evidence, and the courtroom began to sense the tide turning. Then, just as Brewer was about to deliver his closing argument, the unexpected happened. The doors to the courtroom burst open, and Detective Lewis himself walked in, flanked by federal agents. Gasps rippled through the crowd as Lewis, looking disheveled and defeated, approached the judge. "Your Honor," he said, his voice cracking, "I have something to say." Everyone held their breath as Lewis took the stand. Under the weight of mounting evidence and the threat of federal charges, he had struck a deal with prosecutors to cooperate. What he revealed was more damning than anyone could have imagined. Not only had he orchestrated the framing of Ryan, but he also implicated a network of officials, including a senior prosecutor and a high-ranking police captain, who had worked together to secure wrongful convictions for personal and political gain. Lewis's testimony was the final nail in the coffin, shattering any remaining doubts about Ryan's innocence. The courtroom erupted into chaos as the implications of his confession sank in. The judge called for order, his gavel striking repeatedly against the bench. Maya felt tears streaming down her face, a mixture of relief and disbelief washing over her. Ryan, too, was overcome with emotion, his hands trembling as he realized the nightmare might finally be over. Within hours, the ruling came down. Ryan's conviction was overturned, and he was declared a free man. The courtroom erupted in applause as the judge delivered the decision, a rare moment of justice in a system that so often fell short. Maya and Ryan embraced, the weight of years of injustice finally lifting from their shoulders. For the first time in over a decade, Ryan stepped outside without shackles, the sun warming his face as a crowd of supporters cheered him on. But just as it seemed the story was over, one final twist emerged. Later that evening, as Maya was reviewing the documents one last time, she noticed something she hadn't seen before. A series of cryptic notes in the margins, written in a code she couldn't decipher. She reached out to a friend who specialized in cryptography, and after hours of analysis, they uncovered the truth. The notes revealed a hidden list of additional victims, names of other individuals who had been wrongfully convicted through the same corrupt system. The list was longer than anyone could have imagined, stretching back decades. Maya stared at the names, her heart heavy, but her resolve stronger than ever. Ryan's freedom was a victory, but it was just the beginning. The fight for justice wasn't over, and she knew she couldn't stop now. She shared the discovery with Ryan, who, despite everything he had endured, agreed to join her in the fight. Together, they vowed to uncover the truth for every name on that list. Knowing that the battle ahead would be just as challenging, but also just as necessary. The story wasn't ending, it was only evolving into a movement that would demand accountability and change.